Alright, welcome to the program, cons. Today, we're going to be trying out something different. We're going to be looking into monkeys and ideologies and loads of other shit and how they all tie up together to transform a man into your friendly neighborhood drug dealer or a mentally disturbed school shooter. Just the fun stuff. Because today, we're going to be discovering the truth about crime. Let's start with the basics. Criminology is essentially a branch of social science which applies scientific principles to study crime, criminal behavior, and punishment. And over time, people, whether you're a criminologist or not, have come up with various theories to speculate the causation for crime. Aristotle says poverty is the parent of crime. Jordan Peterson says income inequality is the causation of crime. And then you have people who say guns kill people kill guns, and so on. But all this speculation leads to one important question. Will ending any of these factors actually end crime? Boy, if it was only that simple. The study of criminal behavior is way too damn complicated to reduce it to a bunch of socio-economical factors. So what we're going to do is hit the structure of crime from several different directions until we are able to come up with a reasonable explanation to understand criminal behavior. That's right, cons. We are going to be designing our own fucking theory, slow and steady with excruciatingly painful details, but towards the end, everything will come together to form a perfect picture. And with all that said, on with the show then. Alright, first things first. What the hell even is a crime? Crime at the very simplest form is a deviant behavior, and society views crime as wrong. There appears to be this collective agreement in the society as to what is right and what is wrong. And when someone deviates away from what is considered right according to the society, and if this behavior seems to pose a direct threat to the functioning of the society, then we slap a label called crime on the behavior, criminal on the person who's exhibiting the behavior, punish the person who has broken the social agreement, and we place a rule to ensure that this behavior is not exhibited again, and this is what we call as the law. All this to ensure that we maintain the social stability of the society. So basically, crime is a subset of deviant behaviors, and if we are able to understand the causation for deviant behaviors, then we can get a better understanding of crime, which raises the question, what causes deviant behaviors? The answer? The society itself. To be more specific, the competitive nature of the society. Every society sets up certain goals and it gives us certain means for accomplishing the set goals. For example, in the American society, the goal is mostly to strive towards economic success. And when it comes to the Indian society, they gravitate more towards garnering a higher status in the society. And the legitimate institutionalized means of accomplishing the said goal is usually to work hard, get a good education, get near perfect grades, get into a job, start earning, or get the benefits of a wealthy ancestor who leaves you money and so on. Now, deviance depends on these two criteria. It depends on whether or not you accept the goals and the means set by the society. As simple as that. Now, our society is a stratified society. Social stratification is a system by which society categorizes people and ranks them in a hierarchy. And throughout history, we have always divided ourselves into different classes or groups. And the deciding factor for these classes doesn't necessarily have to be wealth. It could also be status or power. Granny Teresa wasn't known for being the wealthiest person, but she did have a high status in the society. Being the president doesn't make you the richest person, but you do get to grab both status and power right by the pussy. But at the end of the day, there appears to be this dominance hierarchy, and people tend to fall within this hierarchy. Now, our society always seems to tell us to aim for the top. It tells us that you can be whatever you want to be. You want to be a doctor or an engineer or the president? Well, if you work hard enough, then you can be one. For example, if you're in a place like India, then you're going to be bombarded by everyone to become a doctor because that's a high pay, high power and high status position. And everything in the society seems to tell us that if you work your ass off, then you can become a doctor. But is that the case though? Fuck no! Let's look at this rationally. There are 426 medical colleges in India with an approximate of 60,000 seats and more than 1 million people who appear wanting to become a doctor. So whether you try your level hardest or not, there's only a 6% chance that you're ever going to make it. And that sucks and it's unfair, but that is how it's supposed to be. Because if everybody was allowed to become a doctor, then it wouldn't be a high status profession anymore and people would not bother pursuing it. Higher classes in the dominance hierarchy needs to be heavily competitive for it to have its value. And it also needs to give you good rewards. The rewards could be in the form of high status, power, or wealth. But at the end of the day, irrespective of what environment you're under, from schools to colleges to any profession, there are limited number of vacancies and a large number of people constantly competing for it within the social structure, either to move up the hierarchy or to maintain their position in the hierarchy. Let's try understanding that using the same example. Say a guy moves up the dominance hierarchy, he's now a doctor working for a well-reputed hospital. So what's next? He has two options. Option 1, he needs to work hard and compete with his peers to move up the dominance hierarchy of the hospital so that he could be rewarded with more power and wealth and his reputation increases. Option 2, he needs to work hard and compete with his peers to maintain his position in the dominance hierarchy so that he doesn't end up becoming the weakest link in the group. Because if he is the weakest link in that group and if there's some other doctor who's better than him, then he loses his place in the hierarchy. And even if he does lose his position in the hierarchy and say gets demoted or joins another hospital or joins an entirely different job, it's the same cycle again where he needs to compete with others in the new environment to move up or maintain his position within the dominance hierarchy of that new environment. So there is this endless cycle of competition going on and people are constantly put under the strain by the society. They keep competing with others trying to become more dominant because that's the only way they can secure a place within the society. But society is unfair. Some people don't come up with the same resources as everyone. A person from a wealthy background might find it easier to get a good education and good training than a poor kid who's down the dominance hierarchy. Some people might feel that the institutionalized means provided by the society are nothing but hindrance to them reaching their goal. Maybe they can reach the goal through better means. And some people are just not physically and mentally competent enough to achieve the goals set by the society. All this leads to a situation where people want to achieve the goals set by the society. They understand that in order to not just survive but to progress within the society, they need to compete with others trying to establish their dominance. But they don't want to use the institutionalized means provided by the society to move forward. They don't want to stick to the goddamn rules because the rules are not helping them progress within the society. So what they do is they get creative. They innovate new ways to achieve the goals of the society. They deviate away from what is considered normal. And this is what leads to this subset of deviant behaviors, innovation by the innovative minds. You could also call them criminals. But all this talk leads to one final question which just needs to be answered. While it's true that some people deviate away from the societal norms and do everything which they can to reach the goals, most people don't. Most people tend to fall under the category of law-abiding citizens. People who conform to the goals and the means provided by the society. These are the people who go, hey, if I can move up the dominance hierarchy through legitimate means, then I'll do it. If I can't, then there's nothing much to do. And if I go homeless, then so be it. But I'm not going to break the social contract to move forward. Why is it that some people deviate away from the societal norms and do everything which they can to reach the goals, but some people don't? Or rather, why do we even form hierarchical societies in the first place and started competing with each other? Or let's just reduce them all into one single question. Why exactly is it that we humans behave the way we do? And to answer that question, we are going to go all the way back to our ancestors, the primates. Because if there's something we learned from evolution and Planet of the Apes, it's that most if not all our core behavioral characteristics can be traced back to the primates, specifically the apes. That is the chimpanzees, the baboons, the bonobos and so on. Simply put, if we want to know who we are in the present, then we need to know who we were in the past. So instead of looking at deviant behaviors as human behaviors, we are going to be looking at it as primate behaviors.
But fucking Abster, humans are unique and superior species. You cannot understand humans by looking at primates.
Wrong. If you look at the phylogenetic tree or the evolutionary tree, which is used to determine the evolutionary relationships among different species, you will notice that around 75 million years ago lived the most common ancestor to today's primates. It was a furry, squirrel-like or a rat-like creature. This common ancestor gradually split off to form different orders of species, some of which includes the lagomorphs, such as rabbits and hares, the rodents, such as mice and rats, and also the primates, such as monkeys and apes. Later on, humans evolved from a certain type of ape. What this indicates is that all the animals which descended from that common ancestor are closely related to each other. And this is the primary reason we use rodents like mice and rats as laboratory animals in medical researchers to study human biology. From formulating new cancer drugs to testing dietary supplements to understanding human behaviors like depression and anxiety, mice and rats play a critical role in developing new medical wonders. This is because their genetic, biological, and behavioral characteristics closely resemble those of human beings due to our shared ancestry. And I want this to be used as a case to show that if a common ancestor between primates and rodents, which was present 75 million years ago, when dinosaurs were freezing into fucking ice popsicles getting extinct, if that ancestor contributed to humans and mice being biologically similar, then that should give you some sort of a clue as to how much similar we would be if we were to look into the characteristics of our direct relatives, the African apes. Especially the chimpanzees and the bonobos, because our lines of descent split off from a common ancestor with the chimpanzees around 6 million years ago. And I understand that our Homo sapien arrogance gets triggered when someone says we are similar to something which looks like this. But unfortunately for us, the Human Genome Project gave us the mightiest spanking when it not only proved that all life forms are ultimately related to each other, but we can also represent this relatedness or similarity as a measurable quantity. And whenever you find something like species A is X% similar to species B, that's pretty much what they do. They compare the sequence genome of the two species. In our case, you take a random sequence of DNA from a human. You align it with a corresponding sequence from a chimpanzee's genome. And what you'll end up finding is that we share 95 to 99% of our DNA with the chimpanzees. DNA is considered as the code of life. And when you poke into a human cell, pluck out the DNA and unwind the whole damn thing, you'll end up getting 4 letters. A, C, G, and T. These are the 4 molecules which made up the DNA. Now a special stretch of DNA, that is a sequence of A's, C's, G's, and T's, could lead to the formation of a gene. And genes determine your traits or characteristics, from the color of your eyes to the shape of your pelvis to what happens to you during your puberty. Some people get an acne, some people get C cups, but at the end of the day, everything is directly or indirectly related to your genes, including your aggressiveness. For example, there is a variant of a gene called monoamine oxidase A, or the warrior gene. And if you happen to possess this variant, then you're far more likely to commit antisocial violence if and only if you were abused as a child. Genes play a crucial role in determining your behaviors. And what we can gather from all this is that when the common primate ancestor split up into chimps and humans, majority of its genetic materials were actually conserved. This leads to things like genes which dictate your behaviors and gene switches which control your genes being copied into both chimps and humans. So we could say that shared ancestry leads to certain shared behaviors. The pronoun certain being the keyword here, because how exactly do you find which traits we inherited from our ancestors and which traits we developed ourselves? The answer is quite simple. We are going to be using an Amanda Wolfchild approach. Common sense. Take a trait A which is being exhibited by humans. See if the same trait is being exhibited by the chimpanzees or any other primate. If it's a match, then that means that this trait is not unique to us humans. We did not develop this trait on our own. We inherited this trait from the common primate ancestor. And obviously it means that every individual among our species should possess this trait. As simple as that. Now with all that said, firstly, one of the primary characteristics when you're considering primates is their ability to form complex social structures. Because primates are very social creatures. They end up forming troops or packs and they try to maintain stability for their own protection and safety. Furthermore, all primates have a social order where the male or the female leads the troop. They have hierarchies of alphas and betas, and the perks of being an alpha ranges from having willing groomers to getting primary access to food to, of course, increased likelihood of getting laid. But most importantly, primates are capable of figuring out their rank in the troop. They know where each one of them stand in the hierarchy. For example, chimpanzees have a linear hierarchical structure where each member has a rank. An alpha male leads a community, but there are other males too which are more or less important. But the males are usually above the females and they dominate them.
Patriarchy.
Kill yourself. Another thing which is interesting about the chimps is that in order to reach the higher ranking position, they need to compete and outperform the members of their own troop through intimidation, strength, and at least on one occasion by exercising their intelligence. The bonobos, on the other hand, are matriarchal. They are led by the females of the troop and they seem to be a very peaceful bunch of primates. And unlike the chimpanzees who use aggression to exhibit dominance or to maintain the social stability of the group, the bonobos use a rather different approach. Whether it's welcoming the shy newcomers into the troop or solving conflicts or fights among two male bonobos, what happens is that the female bonobos cross over, and just have sex with the male bonobos to release the tension. For the bonobos, sex is used for almost everything, including conflict resolution, showing affection, reducing stress, and also exhibiting dominance. But what's really important here is that both our primate cousins, the chimpanzees and the bonobos, have a social hierarchy. One uses its aggression to exhibit dominance, while the other uses its sexuality to exhibit dominance. But at the end of the day, both exhibit a dominance hierarchy. And this is where the shared genetic behaviors we were talking about comes into picture. Because whether you're considering the chimpanzees, the bonobos, or even the baboons, the monkeys, and pretty much most of the primates in general, they seem to form a social structure which contains a hierarchy, and they try to climb the structure to a high-ranking position by exhibiting their dominance in order to drown in the rewards. That is, primates are reward-driven organisms, classic human behavior, social stratification, that is us having this excess need to form hierarchical societies, which leads to a never-ending cycle of competitiveness, which ultimately leads to deviant behaviors, is not specifically a human characteristic, it's a primate characteristic. We behave the way we do because we are primates, and primates are genetically predisposed to behave in that specific manner. And it's completely reasonable for people to go, whoa, they're absurd. Just because other primates can form a hierarchy does not mean they go around murdering their own kind and committing organized crimes and minor genocides like us human beings. And to that I'd say, if only that was true. Play that shit.
First example. Any of us, when we were brought up on all those like National Geographic specials and those ones on some animal species, there would always be the same like stentorian narrator at the end saying something like, and man is the only animal that kills for pleasure, and like that was one of our defining things. And as people have done more and more primatology, it's clear we are not the only species that kills. All sorts of occurrences in other species where it could be violent, cold-blooded, hot-blooded, premeditated, planned. It can be Machiavellian in terms of its strategic consequences. It could be savagely bludgeoning. It could be just like we do when we kill another member of our own species. And most remarkably, it's not even unique to us anymore to have organized violence. Now here's one example from one of the troops of baboons that I study, and this is a male who had joined one of the troops a few weeks before as an adolescent, and the only way to describe this guy is he had terrible political skills, and he was hassling all sorts of guys he had no business going anywhere near, and one evening a coalition of 6 of them ganged up on him, and this is what was left in the morning. We are not the only species that kills, and in this organized way.
Alright, with that entire segment still in your head, let's look at another example. What you're seeing here are several instances of what I'd like to call chimpanzee rebellions, where groups of low-ranking subordinate chimps teamed up together and organized an attack to kill their dominant alpha. Now what separates all these instances from the previous one is not about chimps exhibiting organized violence or them killing the members of their own kind, but it's about who they killed using those traits. Because similar to how we human beings have law and order to maintain the social stability of the society, chimpanzees and other primates have a social order to maintain the social stability of their troops or packs. The social order usually has the dominant alpha at the top of the hierarchy, where it leads the community by commanding the subordinate primates, and the subordinate primates know their role, shut their mouths and follow the alpha's commands. But it turns out, primates, specifically the chimpanzees and us humans, seem to be the only 2 observed species who are capable of teaming up together, breaking whatever social order is in place and organizing a revolution against the dominant alpha. Not only is this a case of organized violence being an innate trait, but it's also a proof that rebelliousness and this desire to break the rules is part of the primate package. And when you add these 2 traits together, along with the fact that primates are reward-driven organisms, then you get something which goes like this. A group of individuals who operate in an organized manner commit illegal acts for their own profit, the definition of organized crime. Humans aren't the only species to exhibit such a behavior. Alright, one final shared characteristic.
The definition of a patrol is to guard by making a regular circuit of an area. This is also true in the forests of Gombe. Every now and again, all of the males will stop eating and calling and will silently leave the community. Cameraman Bill Wallauer was amazed when he first saw this patrol behavior.
I'll never forget this moment when they all line up on a ridge, 46 chimps, mothers, infants, every male in the community, and scan the hillsides below. And we're high up in the valley, looking down across this range. And they were obviously looking for the enemy. It was just, wow, this is almost like clan warfare from what we read of our ancestors. It was really telling about chimps, the way they together moved as a unit, climbing trees, listening, looking to each other. They stopped calling. It was a real change in their behavior. That was the first time I ever experienced such a thing.
Exactly. What you just saw was a chimpanzee border patrol. What happens is all the adult male chimpanzees gather towards the border of their territory and they scan their surroundings to see if any chimpanzee from the neighboring group are entering their territory. And if they happen to find any chimpanzees from the neighboring group entering their territory, then these guys turn into a bunch of drunk schoolgirls, scratching them and biting them and tearing them apart, with the ultimate result ending with the in-group members cannibalizing the out-group victims, a little to exhibit some of that us versus them mentality and a lot more for the extra proteins. But something else which was truly terrifying was a study done by Jane Goodall on chimpanzee warfares. If the male chimpanzees of one group find the males in the other group getting along, then these guys get really scared because the other group could end up becoming a potential threat to them. And there have been instances where the males of such group eradicated every single member of the neighboring group except the adult females who were forced to incorporate into the dominant group. Not only is this so damn similar to the way we humans behaved in olden times during wars, where we killed the males while capturing the females for extracurricular activities, but what you're seeing here definitely resembles that of genocide, where you're killing an individual not for who they are, but simply because of which group they belong to. Humans don't seem to be the only species to exhibit such a behavior. In fact, there have been only 3 observed species who are capable of destroying entire social groups: the chimpanzees, the wolves, and us humans. And surprisingly, all 3 of us seem to be hierarchical troop animals. Alright, let's just join all the puzzle pieces together and get to the meat of this video. First and foremost, violence is innate and it's necessary for you, me and everybody to be open to the possibility that some of the worst violent and deviant behaviors which we consider as wrong and evil have never been unique to us humans. What that means is that these behaviors are the result of our lowly origins. They are the result of this lovely little ancestor passing down its genetic materials to us, and it's present in each and every single one of us. And this does make a lot of sense because from 23 sad years of living among humans, if there's one thing I can say with absolute certainty, it's that when it comes to us humans, we really don't hate violence. In fact, we go as far as to wait in line and pay our hard-earned cash just to watch a bunch of nutheads put their lives on the line and smash themselves through a solid wall of fuck you, bleeding all sorts of bodily fluids for us. But we call this shit entertainment and we cheer for it. We definitely have this lust for blood and gore and violence, but only if it's the right kind. Because in one situation, throwing a man off a steel cage calls for a celebration. Do the same thing to Barack Obama and it's life, liberty and prison food. People would be horrified by what you just did. Firing a gun in one situation lands you medals and cheers and all the love you could possibly gather. But in another situation, it lands you straight in jail and society is going to hate you for it. And that's what everything just boils down to. It's not that we humans want a world without violence, we love violence. What we want is a world without the wrong type of violence. But nevertheless, violence is innate. So, question. If violence is innate and if everybody is capable of exhibiting violence, then what exactly triggers a person into exhibiting the wrong type of violence? The answer, a wide variety of things. For example, meet Charles Whitman, a highly intelligent young guy who was described as polite, well-mannered and someone who seldom lost his temper. But guess what? He ended up becoming the infamous American mass murderer, the Texas Tower Sniper. On August 1st, 1966, Whitman brutally murdered his mother, then his wife. Then he ended up climbing the university tower with several guns and shot everything which moves, killing 15 people while wounding 31. So where exactly did this twisted change in his behavior come from? Well, it turns out, several days before climbing the tower, Whitman wrote himself a letter or more of a suicide note. I do not really understand myself these days. I am supposed to be an average, reasonable and intelligent young man. However, lately I have been a victim of many unusual and irrational thoughts. These thoughts constantly recur and it requires a tremendous mental effort to concentrate on useful and progressive tasks. Further in the letter, Whitman also complained about experiencing severe headaches and overwhelmingly violent impulses. He later went on to request an autopsy to be done on his remains to determine if there was any biological reason behind his behavior and his increasingly intense headaches. And well, the American mass murderer got his request fulfilled. The autopsy was done the very next day and doctors found a walnut-sized tumor pressing against a region of his brain called the amygdala. The amygdala, which is the area in your brain which plays a major role in fear, a major role in anxiety, and the most important of them all, it plays a major role in aggression. This is the part of your brain which is not only associated with your morality and emotions and a range of other important social functions, but it's also central in triggering your fight or flight response. Now, where's the evidence? Animal testing. Take an animal subject, take a bunch of recording electrodes which respond to electrical signaling and stick it into the animal's brain. Now show that animal something that evokes fear or anger. And what you'll end up observing is that the animal's amygdala would have been activated. Now repeat the same thing in a human subject, put them in a brain scanner and show them something that evokes fear or aggression. And what you'll end up observing this time is increasing levels of activity in the amygdala. What you're seeing here indicates a link between your aggressiveness and your amygdala, which raises the question, if your aggressiveness is connected to your amygdala, then what happens when you try increasing the activity in the amygdala? You know the drill by now, screw around with a bunch of animals. Take an animal subject, take an electrode and stick it into the animal's amygdala. But this time send a small electrical current into that region to stimulate it. And what ends up happening is that the animal will start exhibiting more fear. It will start panicking more and it will begin to exhibit wildly aggressive behaviors. And this is what scientists believe happened in Whitman's situation. Having a tumor pressing against his amygdala might have apparently stimulated it, increasing his aggressiveness, leading to an incredibly disturbing behavioral change in that man. Could the amygdaloid tumor be the sole reason behind this aggressive outburst? It's hard to say. But Whitman did have a traumatic childhood. He grew up being beaten by his father and watching his mother and siblings experience the same. And there are plenty of studies which link both childhood neglect and childhood abuse to adult criminality. For example, a National Institute of Justice study indicated that being abused or neglected as a child increased the likelihood of arrest as a juvenile by 59%. Abuse and neglect also increase the likelihood of both adult criminal behavior and violent crime significantly. And if you're wondering how exactly childhood abuse influences your behavior, then it again has a lot to do with your amygdala. If a child experiences frequent fear due to childhood abuse, the amygdala becomes overwhelmed by the need to process too much information. This can damage it in two main ways. A. The amygdala ends up becoming overactive and remains constantly stuck on red alert. And we've already seen what exactly that does. Higher the activity in your amygdala, higher the things like your fear, your anxiety, and most importantly, your aggressiveness. Now, on the flip side of that, we have the second category, B. Instead of the amygdala becoming overactive, it ends up shutting down as a way of protecting the individual from intolerable feelings of being in danger. And what you get as a result of this is that the person ends up feeling empty, numb, and emotionally dead. And given the fact that Charles Whitman kind of made others feel physically dead, we could say that he belongs in the first category. childhood abuse leading to an overactive amygdala. So maybe in Whitman's situation, being abused as a child could have set the foundation to a lot of neurological issues, and the amygdaloid tumor could have just made everything worse by amplifying his aggressive and impulsive side to a very large extent. Does this make what Whitman did any less worse? Don't know, don't care, and not the point of the video, because what's more important here is to understand that your aggressiveness is linked to your amygdala, and there are various factors which are capable of increasing the activity in your amygdala, which in turn increases the likelihood of you behaving in a more aggressive manner. And the most unfortunate thing about all this is that those factors, they might not necessarily be under your control. Anyways, moving on. More depressing stuff. Things which affect your behaviors. Example 2. This is Phineas Gage, Neuroscience's most famous patient. Phineas was an American railroad construction foreman who became largely known for having met with a nightmarish accident. On September 13, 1848, an accidental gunpowder explosion propelled a large 3-foot 7-inch 13-pound iron tamping rod straight through Phineas's head, blowing out a region of his brain called the prefrontal cortex. And if there's ever an appropriate time to say mind is equal to fucking blown, it would be now, because Phineas miraculously survived. For the most part at least, his memory was fine, he was able to walk, talk, look like a freaking badass with a missing eyeball. But his personality on the other hand, boy did that go for a dramatic change, so much so that the friends who knew him started referring to him as no longer Gage. Phineas Gage, the man who was once well respected for being a responsible and well-mannered individual, the person who was once described by his employers as the most efficient and capable foreman, ended up turning into this uncharacteristically wild, abusive and antisocial individual. His out-of-control behavior got him kicked out of his job, and he was ultimately reduced to having his skull appear as an exhibit in a museum, and Stranger Things Season 2 Episode 3. Now, let's get to the fun part. What's the cause? What gave rise to Phineas's dramatic personality change? Well, at that time during the 19th century, Phineas was a great medical curiosity. The doctor who diagnosed him came up with a very unsurprising theory. Here's this guy who suddenly started behaving like an antisocial maniac. Maybe it has a lot to do with his brain getting blown out. And 170 years later, fast forwarding into the present, we could look at their theories and go, pretty accurate, because your prefrontal cortex, or your PFC, which was the part of Phineas's brain that was blown out, that's the brain region which is responsible for doing all sorts of complicated stuffs. Things like self-control, decision-making, judgment, impulse regulation, and a gazillion other different things which prevents you from going out of control. But the most important thing about your prefrontal cortex is the fact that it's connected to your amygdala. And one of your PFC's major duty is to regulate your emotions by regulating your amygdala. Meaning, in tough situations, it's up to your prefrontal cortex to reach to your aggressive and impulsive amygdala in time and go, hey amygdala, I know you want to punch that guy really hard and it will definitely make you feel good, but you're not rich enough to handle the lawsuit he'll file against you when everything is over. Your prefrontal cortex acts as the rational decision-making authority of your brain. It helps you think through your actions by reminding you of the long-term consequences. It keeps you in line, it makes you follow the rules, and it prevents you from going out of control. Now, pull a Phineas Gage and get into some sort of a situation which injures your prefrontal cortex or your brain in general, and you end up damaging the mental machinery which is highly associated with your self-control and rational thinking and all the other good stuff. And the thing is, in a lot of situations, this might actually be one of the major contributing factor which separates a law-abiding citizen from a person who might end up doing some serious jail time. And you don't necessarily have to believe me, listen to the experts. Enter criminologist Adrian Raine.
Thank you.
One of the challenges that society is facing with new neuroscience knowledge is how we deal with prisoners who have a brain basis to their behavior, or who may have a brain basis to their behavior. This issue or dilemma really starts with neurological research, which has indicated that patients who suffer damage to the underneath part of the frontal cortex are more likely to be psychopathic-like, to be antisocial, and to break rules of society. Well, those are neurological cases, but what about murderers? What about violent offenders? Well, really, the science is not all that new. 15 years ago, we did a study on 41 murderers and matched them to 41 normal controls and compared their brain scans. What you see here in this slide is a picture of a brain scan of a normal control. You're looking down on the brain here. The warm colors, red and yellow, indicate high glucose metabolism. And as you see in the front part of the brain of the normal controls, you see a lot of activation, a lot of red and yellow, indicating high glucose metabolism, a good functioning prefrontal cortex. On the right, you see the scan of a murderer, and you can see there a distinct lack of activation in that top part, the prefrontal cortex. And it makes some theoretical sense, because the frontal cortex is very much involved in controlling and regulating both emotion and behavior. So it's as if the murderers have the emergency brake on behavior broken. They get out of control if they're irritated.
Of course, there's more to Adrian's study than that, but pretty much the gist of it is that if you were to take murderers as a group, then you are going to find a certain level of brain basis to their behavior. You're going to find out that these people have a damaged or an injured or an incredibly dysfunctional prefrontal cortex. Well, actually, out of the 41 murderers who were brain scanned and studied, 23 of them had pulled a Phineas Gage. 23 of them had a history of receiving a brain injury. And if any of y'all are like, shut the fuck up, Abster, that's just a small study. It's not like prisons and jails are crawling with people who got hit in the head too hard, right? Well, to that I'd say you're gonna be surprised. Here's something interesting. During the year 2007, CDC and the US National Center for Injury Prevention and Control released a 5-page document recognizing TBI in prisons and jails as an important public health problem. TBI, or traumatic brain injury, is the most widespread form of brain injury. And the things which cause TBI usually ranges from accidentally falling down and hitting your head to someone intentionally crack opening a bottle of champagne using another person's skull. Basically, some form of external force which impacts your head hard enough to injure your brain. Anyway, statistics. If you were to take the general population of any country, you'll notice that the number of people who are estimated to suffer from a traumatic brain injury is around less than 10%. But if you were to look into the prison population, however, studies from across the world have shown that this number dramatically rises up to somewhere between 50 and 80%. Which means that the rate of brain injuries amongst offender population, that is amongst criminals, is way higher than the general population itself. To be more specific, the rate of TBI is 5 to 8 times higher amongst criminals compared to society as a whole. And if you're wondering how exactly is this relevant to your prefrontal cortex, then surprise, surprise! MRI studies have shown that your frontal area is the most common region of your brain to get injured during TBI. Frontal area, as in the area in the very front of your brain. We are talking about prefrontal cortex injury. And here's the thing, studies which link violence and head trauma, they're not even something new. In fact, they go all the way back to the Vietnam War, where Vietnam veterans with damage to a particular area of the frontal lobe, a region known as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, consistently demonstrated aggression and violence which was significantly higher than what the control subject showed. Does this mean that getting a prefrontal cortex injury turns you into a bunch of criminals? Absolutely not. All these brain imaging studies and statistical data point towards one thing and one thing alone, and that's correlation. And as the statistics mantra goes, correlation does not equal causation, but it does imply contribution. And looking at these high numbers and the science surrounding TBI, we could say that brain injury, specifically frontal brain injury, does contribute a great deal to criminal behavior. And the most fucked up thing about all this is that you don't necessarily need a traumatic brain injury to mess up your prefrontal cortex. And you definitely don't require an amygdaloid tumor to screw your amygdala. Because sometimes all you need is just to be born bad. Which brings us to the next segment. Things which affect your behaviors. Example 3. Personality disorders. Personality disorder is a type of mental disorder which involves in long-term patterns of thoughts and behaviors that are unhealthy and inflexible. And one of the most well-known, well-established and possibly the most disturbing personality disorder is APD, Antisocial Personality Disorder. Medline describes this disorder as a mental condition in which a person has a long-term pattern of manipulating, exploiting, or violating the rights of others. Now, to list a few of their behaviors, people with APD usually have a low moral sense or conscience. They often tend to lie a lot and manipulate others either for their own personal benefit or because they are bored. In fact, chronic boredom, that's also a symptom of APD. It's as if these people get so damn bored to the point where they can't tolerate it, so they end up doing reckless and destructive things just to fix the issue. A lot of them are violent and aggressive, but their aggression is more towards the reactionary and impulsive side. Hot-headed seems to be the best way to describe the aggressive ones. And all in all, people with APD just seem to have a pretty tough time giving a shit about other people's feelings. In other words, reduced empathy, that's also one of their defining characteristics. Now, let's get to the important part. When we have a personality disorder which is characterized by all sorts of these lovely positive qualities, then we know that it's going to be associated with crime. But the question is, how relevant is APD in understanding criminal behavior? The answer, incredibly relevant. Let's begin with the statistics. About 1 to 3% of the general population are people who have APD, which seems pretty low. But switch your focus to the prison population and you'll find that this number jumps up all the way to somewhere between 50 and 80%. Which means that more than half of the criminals locked up in jails are people with an actual personality disorder. Scary shit. And it turns out there might actually be a biological reason, a brain explanation behind these people's behaviors. Take a bunch of people who have been diagnosed with APD, especially the ones who have a history of violent and criminal behaviors. Now shove them in an MRI machine to brain scan them. And what you'll end up finding is that on average, people with antisocial personality disorder have 11 to 14% reduction in the volume of grey matter or neurons in the prefrontal cortex region. That's about 2 teaspoons worth of prefrontal cortex material missing in these people. An actual physical abnormality in the PFC. And that's what's incredibly important here. Because the whole point of the evolution segment was not necessarily to share some monkey love. But it was to point out that things like rule breaking and homicides and genocides and every other fucking side are all the result of our evolutionary history. They are our innate traits. In a way, we are all potential criminals well capable of exploding, but what prevents us from lashing out and going out of control is that guardian angel on behavior. It's our prefrontal cortex. And the fact that more than half of the criminals out there have that particular brain region broken tells us a lot about why these people behave the way they do. And it doesn't just end there. Let's switch the focus to another group of interesting people, psychopaths. A group of people with extreme cases of antisocial personality disorder, a group which is incredibly well known for being this ruthless, manipulative, and a lot of times violent individuals who are borderline incapable of feeling emotions like empathy, guilt, shame, and remorse, and a group of people who are highly associated with all sorts of criminal behaviors. Statistics. Although psychopaths make up only about 1% of the general population, they are estimated in prison studies to occupy somewhere around 15 to 25% of the offender or, well, prison population. And here comes the best part. This 15 to 25% of psychopathic criminals are responsible for more than 50% of all serious crimes committed. Half of all law enforcement officers murdered in the line of duty were killed by these psychopaths. Around 10 to 15% of child molesters and 40 to 50% of rapists are psychopaths, and overall about 78% of imprisoned psychopaths are there because of a violent offense. In other words, not all psychopaths are criminals, but the ones who are, they seem to be committing a lot of fucking crimes. And you know what's coming up next. Take a bunch of psychopathic criminals, especially the ones who have murder, rape, and other violent offenses in their job description. Now throw them all in an MRI machine to brain scan them. And what you'll end up finding is a whole range of functional and structural abnormalities in various regions of their brain. The two most notable ones are: 1. Similar to antisocial criminals, psychopaths, especially psychopathic criminals, have a significant reduction in the volume of grey matter in the prefrontal cortex region. In fact, if you look at the percentage value, you'll find that this number is much worse than what we saw among the antisocial criminals. And we've already seen what an abnormal PFC does. Poor functioning prefrontal cortex leads to things like poor self-control, impulsivity, and a lack of proper judgment. Now, with that said, secondly, in addition to an abnormal prefrontal cortex, individuals with psychopathy showed a significant volume reduction in various regions of their amygdala, which does make a lot of sense because your amygdala is one of those brain regions which is responsible for the generation of emotions. And psychopaths, especially psychopathic criminals, lack emotions. They are cold-hearted individuals. And that's the thing which really makes a difference now, doesn't it? Because most of us at some point in time have definitely fantasized about doing something wrong and illegal. Some of us have thoughts about stealing something valuable, and some of us straight up have homicidal thoughts. In fact, there have been multiple surveys and studies which was able to show that homicidal ideation, that is thinking or fantasizing about killing someone, is actually quite common among people. One such study, which was done during 2005, which I believe is also the largest study to be done on this subject, was able to find out that around 91% of men and 84% of women have had at least one fantasy of committing murder, often intense and astonishingly detailed. And to top it all off, these fantasies were apparently similar to those reported by actual murderers. So yes, thinking or fantasizing about hurting someone or doing something incredibly illegal is indeed quite normal among people. But the reason why we don't really act on these thoughts is due to our emotions. Emotions like fear, guilt, empathy, having a fucking conscience, you name it. These pesky emotional feels in most situations prevents us from harming others or breaking the law. It keeps us grounded. Psychopaths, on the other hand, they don't even have this option available to them. It's not like these people are unable to find the difference between what's right and what's wrong. They do understand that cognitively. What they lack is the feeling of what's right and what's wrong. And if you're the type of person who lacks or has a tough time grasping the feeling of what's right, then there's definitely a chance that you might end up doing something that's incredibly wrong. But let's not forget the source of all the problems here: structural brain abnormalities. That is, the rational parts of the brain, the emotional parts of the brain, and various other brain regions which is responsible for our moral decision making is pretty much abnormal among these psychopathic criminals. And these brain abnormalities might very well be the reason as to why these people behave the way they do. Alright, one final study to wrap this segment up. What you're seeing here is a 20-year longitudinal study done in the island of Mauritius, which gathered nearly 1,800 3-year-old children of different ethnicity and examined them on something known as fear conditioning. Now, I don't really want to get too deep into what fear conditioning actually is, but all you need to know is that having poor fear conditioning early in life implicates brain dysfunctions, especially amygdala and prefrontal cortex dysfunctions. Pretty similar to what we've seen among psychopathic criminals. Anyways, back to the study. After examining those 3-year-old children for fear conditioning, the researchers of the study followed them for 20 long years. Basically, they waited for some of those cute and precious little 3-year-old kids to turn into a bunch of serious criminals, which they did. 137 of those kids, that's nearly 8% of those children, grew up to become a bunch of criminal offenders. Now, they took all these grown-up criminals and compared them to the non-criminals to find out what's the thing which separates these two different groups. And what they found out was that the criminal offender group showed significantly reduced fear conditioning compared to the matched comparison subjects. In other words, those 3-year-old children who had initially showed poor fear conditioning, a lot of those kids were the ones who grew up to become criminal offenders. Keep in mind, poor fear conditioning implicates amygdala and prefrontal cortex dysfunctions. But much more importantly, keep in mind that the individuals who were examined were bloody 3-year-old kids. 3 years old, that is before environment and culture and the bitch known as life is able to truly slap you across your face. And as if that's not enough, the researchers of the study went one step further and controlled for various social adversities like single parenthood, having uneducated parents, teenage pregnancy, and all these other nurture related things, which leaves only one factor remaining, and that's our biology. My final depressing piece of evidence to show that sometimes some people are just born bad. Alright, finally, let's get to the conclusion. The truth about crime, or rather the truth about the underlying cause of crime, is simply put, it's complicated. There is no silver bullet to shoot down crime, because there's no such thing as a single magical factor which could be considered a parent, a grandparent, or a stepmother of crime. Crime or criminal behavior is multi-causal. There are several factors which contribute to crime, and there are multiple levels of causality. And for a long time, we as a society have been heavily focusing on things like poverty and income inequality and gun control and bad neighborhoods and various other socio-economical / environmental or nurture related things. And rightfully so. Yes, these are all things which are incredibly important. And so's are biology and genetics. In fact, it's so damn important that nearly 200 twin and adoption studies have shown that a full half of aggression, crime, and violence can be chalked up to genetic influences. And more than 100 brain imaging studies have now documented structural and functional brain impairments or abnormalities in aggressive adolescents and violent adult offenders. And the goal of this 50+ minute long, God knows when it's going to end video was to give you guys a tiny little peek into this beautiful world of brain tumors and traumatic brain injuries and people who are affected by some of the most disturbing personality disorders and people who are born with an incredibly dysfunctional brain structure, and how all these biological or brain related factors are capable of amplifying and bringing out some of our worst of the worst primate behaviors. And also, even when you take social or environmental factors like childhood abuse or childhood neglect or just severe psychological trauma in general, you'll notice that these factors are actually capable of affecting you on a biological level. They are capable of completely destroying the way your brain functions. And of course, last but definitely not the least, the cherry on top of the coffin is that a significant portion of the prison population, those so wicked, evil and dangerous criminals, are people who have been affected by a large number of these brain-altering factors. And if your brain is the thing which is heavily responsible for your behaviors, then bad and broken brain should be heavily responsible for bad behaviors. And a large group of criminals out there, they fit exactly in that category. A bunch of people who have been royally screwed by a wide range of these mental fuck-ups. They are people who have been damaged by a large number of these brain-altering factors. And the most twisted thing about all this, it's that those factors, they are way beyond anyone's control. None of the criminals out there chose to get affected by those factors. They were just miserably unlucky. Nothing more, nothing less. And that, everybody, is the so-called truth about crime. The end. Catch you guys next year. Next time? I meant next time. For fuck's sake.
Come to the dark side.